Dr. Sarah Ahrens is an Inupiaq earth scientist and assistant professor at Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego. She's also the co-leader of the IARPC Collaboration's Diversity and Inclusion Working Group. Sarah specializes in climate change, Earth's surface processes, isotope geochemistry, and paleoclimatology. She was born in Dillingham and raised in Anchorage, with her maternal family hailing from Unalakleet. So welcome, Sarah. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can take it from here.
Okay, thank you for the really nice introduction. Let me just pull up my PowerPoint. And did that show up okay?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, all right, great. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming today. I really appreciate all the participants coming for the talk today. So I'm going to be speaking about climate change impacts on Indigenous peoples, specifically Arctic, or actually more specifically focused on Alaska, because that's where I was born and raised, and kind of provide a historical perspective. But before I begin, I kind of wanted to talk a little bit more about like who I am, or how I identify. So Liz already mentioned that I was born in Dillingham, which is on the Bristol Bay. My mother is, she was born and raised in Unalakleet, Alaska. She's a Inupiaq. And my father is from Los Angeles, and he moved to Alaska in the 70s, and he's Jewish. My mother was Martha Anigik Ahrens, and my father is Charles Ahrens. My maternal grandparents were Lowell Anigik and Betty, and her maiden name is Nanauk Anigik from Unalakleet. So my family, we moved to Anchorage when I was about 1. I have 3 sisters. I'm showing a kind of snapshot of family photos on this slide. We come from a family that was really active in both commercial fishing, but also subsistence fishing. So I have a few pictures of us in Dillingham and some of the boats, commercial fishing boats that we had in Dillingham. Like a lot of Alaska Native or Alaska families in general, we love subsistence activities. So things like berry picking, fishing. I spent a lot of my summers at fish camp in Aleknagik, Alaska, outside of Dillingham, or hanging out with Unalakleet with a lot of my cousins, just learning how to fish and pick berries. So I left the state for college when I was 18. I went to Stanford, and I then went to graduate school at the University of Michigan. I currently live in San Diego, California. A lot of my PhD research focused on Antarctica, so not the Arctic, but I'm slowly trying to transition my way back into the Arctic. And I'm actually currently speaking to you from Anchorage, Alaska on Denina land. And I've been fortunate enough to travel up here for a little bit of field work and to spend some time with family. So much of what I'm going to share with you today is a modified lecture talk that I gave to the class that I've been teaching this past quarter that just finished yesterday. So the class is titled Climate Change Impacts on Arctic Indigenous Peoples. And it's the historical perspective. It talks a lot about the links between colonialism and capitalism and climate change and how this is impacting the people who live in the Arctic. I want to point out that it's impossible for me to detail the entire history of the successive waves of colonialism and its subsequent impact in less than an hour. I'm going to do my best to cover as much as I can, but there are many perspectives and experiences and viewpoints that I won't cover here. So this is a kind of a polar projection of the Arctic, and it's not one that a lot of people are used to seeing. And I like to show it because it just kind of shows a different perspective of the world. And I'm also showing the different Indigenous peoples that live in the Arctic. Right, so over 4 million people live in the circumpolar Arctic. This area spans Canada, the United States, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Greenland, Norway, Sweden, and Russia. And the different Indigenous people in the Arctic are kind of listed here and broken up by color a bit. Alaska has more detail because I'm going to be focusing on Alaska here, but there's over 40 different ethnic groups that live in the Arctic. So Arctic indigenous peoples include, for example, the Sami in circumpolar areas of Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And then in Alaska, we have Aleut, Yupik, and Inuit. We also have Inuit people who live in Canada and Greenland as well. And I wanted to point out that there's quite a large variability in the cultural, historical, and economical backgrounds of each group of people. But there is one common thing that ties everyone together. And this theme here is that climate change is posing a really unique threat for Arctic Indigenous peoples in the form of food security, housing and infrastructure, damage from severe weather, loss of sea ice as a platform for protection against storm surges, and also for hunting and fishing. So zooming in a little bit more on Alaska specifically, I'm showing a map that I created that's showing the Alaska Native tribal geographies. And this is basically a modified map that I've seen before, but it's showing you the different tribal groups that exist in Alaska, right? And so I'm in Anchorage right now on Dena'ina land, and that's shown by this little black dot here. I was born in Dillingham, it's Yupik land near Bristol Bay. And then my mom was born and raised in Unalakleet, which is up here on Inupiaq land, right? And so as you can see, there's different groups of people living in different geographies of the state, and throughout the Arctic and the circumpolar north, the ancestors of Alaska or Alaska Natives established various indigenous and very complex cultures. And I like to refer to their ways of life and the way that they, approach subsistence activities. So living off the land is the ultimate peer review. Because a lot of the traditional knowledge that's handed down through subsistence activities to younger generations has been through the ringer in terms of dealing with the complex climate and environmental conditions that have been, Alaska has been subjected to for the past, thousands of years, right? And so knowing this crucial type of information about, when does this salmon swim up this river, or when will this berry be ripe for picking, things like this. These are pieces of knowledge that have direct consequences for food security and ultimately survival of people who live in the Arctic. Right, so just as the cultures are really diverse across the state, the natural resources, the geography, and the climate change impacts are also quite unique. So I'm kind of showing a little bit of photos as to like what each region is somewhat known for. In Southeast Alaska, logging is really prevalent. Southwest Alaska, Bristol Bay region, it's the largest wild salmon fishery in the world. And then in Northwest Alaska and the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, they're dealing with the impacts of thawing permafrost and heightened rates of erosion, right? And one thing that I wanted to point out that was prior to colonization, there were many communities that were living in semi-nomadic camps or lifestyles. So they're living a subsistence lifestyle where they're moving from place to place and getting food from the land. So these types of food vary by geographic location, local preference, and season. Fish has been and will be a primary staple for much of the state, along with marine mammals, game meats, berries, and tundra greens. And because of this subsistence lifestyle, Indigenous people are typically experts in observing the environment and changes in the environment. Right now, there's actually 229 federally recognized tribes in Alaska with the right of tribal sovereignty. So this is basically saying that they have the right of self-governance. A lot of communities are located off the grid. And what I mean by that is basically they're not located on the road system. They're in places that are only accessible by plane or by boat. And the transport of food to these villages and towns is extremely costly. So the purchase of fresh food can be really prohibitively expensive. Alaska Native people prior to colonization all spoke their traditional languages. It varies by region. And they lived a subsistence lifestyle. This changed significantly when explorers, missionaries, and settlers first came to Alaska. And again, I'm kind of highlighting the major impacts that we're seeing in Alaska in terms of food security and not necessarily food security, but also resilience of communities. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the Russian colonial period was basically the time of first contact of Europeans to Alaska. So in 1741, there was a second voyage by Bering that made sight of the North American mainland. So Russian trappers and hunters quickly developed the maritime fur trade, which actually instigated several conflicts between the Aleuts and the Russians in the 1760s. The fur trade was a very lucrative enterprise. It captured the attention of other European nations. Notably, between the 1740s and the 1830s, there was the enslavement of Aleut and Aleutic people by Russians for this fur trade. In 1784, from encouragement by Catherine the Great, there was the formation of Russia's first permanent settlement in Alaska at Three States Bay. So 10 years later, the first group of Orthodox Christian missionaries began to arrive, evangelizing and converting thousands of Native Americans, many of whom their descendants continue to maintain this religion. By the late 1780s, the trade relations had opened with the Tlingits, and in 1799, the Russian-American company formed in order to monopolize the fur trade. So this kind of served as this imperialist vehicle for the Russification of Alaska Natives. So angered at the encroachment on their land and among other grievances like enslavement, for example, the indigenous peoples' relationships with the Russians deteriorated. In 1802, Tlingit warriors destroyed several Russian settlements, most notably Redoubt St. Michael, or also known as Old Sitka, leaving New Russia as the only main remaining outpost in Alaska. So this failed to expel the Russians, and they reestablished their presence 2 years later following the Battle of Sitka that happened in 1804. And I'm showing some artistic renderings of what this may have looked like during that time period. So an important kind of outcome from Russian contact and colonization is that as Russia was expanding into indigenous territory in present-day Alaska, there was this spread of Russian orthodoxy and also a consuming of the natural resources of the territory along the way. So their movement into these populated areas of indigenous communities altered the demographics and also the natural landscape. I'm showing a 19th century engraving, which was the former headquarters of the Russian American Company, which is now the city of Sitka. And in 1824, a Russian missionary started the first all-colonial school to educate natives and mixed Native and Russian people. So this is kind of the first, pop-up of a form of assimilation through a residential school or a colonial school. Another thing that was a byproduct of contact and colonization is epidemics. So groups of people coming in who may have had immunity to certain diseases are entering into land and exposing people who have never before been exposed to these types of diseases. So there were waves of epidemics that washed over the state. For example, tuberculosis, smallpox, measles, chickenpox, whooping cough, and influenza epidemics spread throughout Alaska, beginning roughly in 1770 and going on through the mid-1850s. There was another epidemic a little bit further, which I'll touch on a bit later. But a lot of the Alaska Native people who were infected with these diseases, they had a low immune status because they'd never before been exposed to it. There was a high death rate. And because of this, there were a lot of orphan children. So I'm showing a few pictures from a little bit later, 1919, some orphan children near Naknek, and then another smallpox patient quarantined in Allotment, Polo. So further along, American colonialism starts to touch Alaska. So the United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, right? And so there was the signing of the Alaska Treaty of Cessation on March 30th. And the price was $7.2 million, which amounted to about 2 cents per acre. There was a lot of skepticism about the purchase. The New York Tribune savaged the decision, deeming it Seward's icebox or Seward's folly. Yeah, okay. And so in 1872, people started to discover that there was actually quite a bit of natural resources in Alaska, including gold, right? And so there was this General Mining Act of 1872, which stated that all citizens of the United States 18 years or older have the right under this law to locate a lode or hard rock or placer, which is a gravel mining claim on federal lands that were open to mineral entry. The Mining Act states that only US citizens may lay claim to land in Alaska. So this meant that Alaska Native people who weren't federally recognized citizens were not eligible to lay claim to gold mines, right? So Congress enacted the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, which granted citizenship to all American Indian and Alaska Native people who weren't already citizens of the United States. Under this act, all Indian and Alaska Native people became US citizens. So it wasn't until this time that Alaska Native people could lay claim to any gold or mineral rights in Alaska. And I'm showing a picture of what Nome, Alaska looked like in 1907. Nome is a really famous place in Alaska for being heavily influenced and impacted by the gold rush that happened there. So another byproduct of the discovery of gold in Alaska is that it led to a rapid influx of settlers looking to get rich quick with the gold mining, right? And so the Chilkoot Trail is a trail that goes through Canada and into Alaska, and it allowed a lot of settlers to travel to Alaska. And it's not really known how long the Chilkoot Trail witnessed Native use. There's been discovery of pre-contact Native artifacts, or actually, sorry, they have yet to be found, but it's conservatively estimated that the trail was used for 200 years prior to initial European contact. So in 1880, the US Navy forced Tlingit people to allow non-natives to access the Chilkoot Trail. And in 1893, gold was found in Birch Creek by Athabascan Russian people, right? And so remember, Alaska Native people couldn't lay claim to gold or mineral rights at that time period. So these claims were invalidated due to their Alaska Native status. The gold rush really started during this time period. And I just wanted to point out that because of this kind of loophole in the law, a lot of Alaska Native people were completely excluded from making any form of money off of the natural resources that existed here in the state. Another byproduct of rapid influx of settlers was basically more disease, right? And so in 1900, the Great Death is what it was called. And this was a novel strain of influenza. It was called the Great Death by Alaska Native survivors, right? And this really overwhelmed Alaska Native villages. It's estimated that over 1/4 to 1/2 of Yupik and Nukbak communities died from this great sickness epidemic. Christian missionaries who were living in the area ended up, kind of capitalizing on the epidemic itself, and they launched a really aggressive Christian conversion campaign directly following this epidemic. And in some cases, entire villages converted to Christianity during this time period, right? And so Euro-Americans who were living in close association with Native Alaskans were relatively untouched by the Great Sickness. For example, only 2 Euro-American deaths were attributed to the epidemics that's been found in historical accounts, right? And I'm showing a picture here of a Native cemetery above Nulato, Alaska. So in some cases, there are entire communities that were completely wiped out. So moving forward a bit, Congress passed the Native Allotment Act, which extended the Dawes Act to Alaska. So the Dawes Act of 1887 regulated land rights on tribal territories within the US, and it authorized the subdivision of land into allotments for Native heads of family, right? And so this was important because you're really converting the traditional systems of land ownership or even the concept of land ownership into government-imposed capitalist private property concepts, right? And this is the beginning of defining tribal belonging in terms of blood quantum. So basically having a Bureau of Indian Affairs card, which dictates how much Inupiaq blood, for example, a particular person had in terms of the fraction. The Allotment Act authorized the Secretary of the Interior to convey up to 160 acres of vacant, unappropriated, and unreserved non-mineral land to Alaska Natives who could prove as the individual head of household substantially continuous use and occupancy of that land for a period of 5 years, right? And so during this time period, more than 10,000 Alaska Native people filed allotment applications before 1971. Some more, citizenship laws were enacted, and these citizenship laws were kind of had the primary goal of assimilation, right? And so the Alaska Territorial Legislature extended this Alaska citizenship to Alaska Native people with an act in 1915. So the Native Citizenship Act was modeled after the General Allotment Act and required the applicant to, quote unquote, sever all tribal relationships, a total abandonment of any tribal customs or relationships, and to obtain a certificate stating such from at least 5 white citizens. So not only were they required to renounce all of their cultural and tribal, ties, but they were also required to go out and get signatures or certifications from 5 other white citizens stating that they had in fact done so. Another, important thing to touch on in terms of assimilation are the residential schools. And I'm showing this slide today because this is something that's been happening really recently, right? And I think many of us are already aware of this, but I'm showing a headline from the New York Times, basically talking about the horrible history, the mass grave of over 215 Indigenous children that were discovered beneath a residential school in British Columbia in Canada, right? And so an Indigenous community, they use ground penetrating radar to find the remains of over 215 children. So residential schools are basically in communities where you don't have enough students or children to build a school. They were often taken from those communities and sent to these residential schools, right? And a lot of people who had children taken away and sent to these schools have been saying for quite a long time that they after those children left, they never saw them or heard from them again. And I think it's really important that this is all coming to light right now. I also, want to point out that it was actually the Indigenous community themselves that led this effort to find the remains. I think one primary goal of the residential schools is the goal of assimilation, right? And so there's a lot of issues related to abuse that happens in these schools and maltreatment and neglect. But I do think that it's an important topic to bring up. And it's happened not only in Canada and the lower 48, but it also was occurring in Alaska as well, right? And so in Alaska, there was the Mount Edgecombe boarding school located outside Sitka. It was a former Sitka naval operating base, right? And so in 1951, the extension of the Johnson-O'Malley Act transferred the education of Native children from the federal government to state and local school systems. Many children were forcibly removed from homes for the purpose of civilizing the children and youth into Euro-American culture at the expense of vilifying and destroying Indigenous culture. Right. So at these schools, many of the children were physically, spiritually, emotionally, and sexually abused. A lot of the students who did return home experienced alienation. So basically feeling like they didn't belong in the communities that they were born in, language and cultural barriers, right? Because speaking their native language was something that was discouraged and punished. PTSD and a legacy of trauma that actually, continues today. I do want to point out that the trauma that Indigenous people have experienced due to the residential schools is not something that necessarily defines them, but it is important to acknowledge it. In In 1966, students from rural Alaska had very few options in terms of where they could go. Mount Edgecombe was one of them. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs operated that, and there were many church-run schools. So St. Mary's Catholic School, Copper Valley at Glen Allen, and Covenant High School in Unalakleet, which is the school that my mother attended. All right. So switching gears a bit, World War II and the wars in Alaska actually shaped Alaska quite a bit as well. And this is not something that I actually learned about until I was in college and undergrad, and actually learned it from another Inupiaq historian. So I'm showing a map that I created for her, but it's basically showing what World War II in Alaska looked like, right? And so in the gray symbols here, I'm showing the locations of battlefields and military bases. So Attu, Kiska, Adak, and Dutch Harbor are down here in the Aleutians, right? And so there were kind of these waves of invasions that happened in June of 1942 to 1943. One thing that I was not aware of at all was the fact that there were Aleut internment camps. So for quote unquote, for their own protection, Aleut people were removed from the Aleutian Islands and transported thousands of miles to Southeast Alaska. And I'm showing the locations of the internment camps as these red X's here, right? And so these internment camps, so in 1942, all natives, all Aleut people with more than 1/8 fraction of Aleut blood were evacuated for their own protection during this Aleutian conflict. 881 of them were forcibly removed from the Aleutians and the Pribilofs and relocated in Southeast Alaska. Many of them died, so about 10% of them died from pneumonia and tuberculosis during this 3-year internment. And they were also forced to do labor as well. Another thing that happened were the Alaska Territorial Guard. So basically, a lot of Alaska Native men were given guns by the US government as kind of the frontier guardsmen. And I'm showing the locations as these white circles here that you may not be able to see because the map is pretty small. Okay, so moving through history a bit, I know I'm kind of fast forwarding or zooming through, and again, I'm trying to cover as much as I can in this time period or in this short session, but I wanted to point out that, like throughout the 20th century, it was really kind of living through history. So in the 1940s, there were signs in Nome, Alaska, and spotted elsewhere that said no dogs, no natives in a lot of restaurants, bars, and other businesses. In 1944, a Nome Inupiaq woman was arrested for sitting in the whites only section of a theater. In 1943 to 1944, Elizabeth Peradovich, showing a couple of, it's a piece of art and a picture of her below here. She petitioned the Alaska legislature to end the Jim Crow laws that existed during this time period. So segregation of natives and non-natives was something that was happening prior to 1943, 1944. And this resulted in this anti-discrimination law in 1945, right? And so, segregation was something that was still pretty common in living history. So there are people alive today who went through these experiences. And Elizabeth Peradovich is a big hero for a lot of Alaska Native people because of the work that she did in terms of abolishing this type of law. Okay. Statehood was granted in Alaska in 1959. The state must disclaim all right and title to lands and other property not granted or confirmed to the state, including the right or title which may be held by any Indians, Eskimos, or Aleuts, or is held by the United States in trust for said natives, right? And so the act went on to state that any land that may belong to natives shall be under the jurisdiction and control of the United States, right? So Congress did not resolve the issue of Aboriginal land claims outright. It was around this time that a lot of Alaska Native leaders began to organize into groups to represent their respective regions in Alaska as they sought a resolution to their land claims, right? In the late 1960s, commercial quantities of oil were discovered on the north slope of Alaska. And in order to facilitate a way to get the oil from the North Slope to the Gulf of Alaska to make it marketable, they first needed to get the oil traversed across the state from the North Slope all the way down to Valdez. It was proposed that this Trans-Alaska pipeline system would be needed to cross over land that was occupied by various Alaska Native groups. So with the fact that Alaska Native land claims were still unsettled and the land freeze in place, the proposed construction of this pipeline was put on hold. These circumstances really put Secretary Udall, the land freeze, in the spotlight, both in Washington, D.C. and in Alaska, right? And so the oil and gas industry at this point and early environmentalist organizations entered the land claims debate, adding many more voices and complexity to this issue. In 1966, the Alaska Federation of Natives formed to advocate for land claim settlement. And this, the fact that oil was discovered is really kind of pushing this issue to the forefront. So the discovery of oil, major discovery, the first one happened on the Kenai Peninsula in 1957. Statehood was granted 2 years later. You had the discovery of oil on the North Slope. More than 12 billion barrels have been extracted since then. Before the discovery of Prudhoe Bay's Elephant oil field, the state's Alaska Native communities traditionally used oil-soaked sod for fuel. And a revised USGS survey estimated 7.8 billion barrels of oil in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So back to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, oil companies with leases on this land were really eager to commercialize their crude. But before they could begin digging, the industry really found itself entrenched in the state of Alaska's dispute over Native ancestral land claims. Congress ultimately stepped in to pass the largest land claim settlement act in US history. They also passed a third bill, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline Authorization Act, which eliminated any additional legal barriers to building the pipeline project. It took the Alaska Pipeline Company only 3 years and $8 billion to complete this 800-mile Trans-Alaska pipeline system and a road to the North Slope. This actually provided quite a bit of economic stimulus for the state. My mom actually worked on the Trans-Alaska pipeline during her summers while she was in college. 40 years ago, I think from this summer, or yeah, maybe I'm wrong on the timing, but oil began flowing from Prudhoe Bay down the pipeline to a new marine terminal, export terminal at Valdez, right? And so since then, it's carried 17 billion barrels of oil and filled almost 22,000 oil takers. To this date, the state of Alaska has collected 141 billion in royalties and taxes from the petroleum extracted from the state lands. Oil taxes provided a steady stream of funding for schools, roads, social services, and things like the Performing Arts Center, right? It's important to note that it's not all, great economic stimulus. With these types of development, there can be environmental disasters. In 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil tanker struck a reef, a Bligh Reef, as it was leaving the Valdez Marine Terminal, and it spilled 10.8 million gallons of oil of North Slope oil into the Prince William Sound. This region was a primary habitat for salmon, sea otters, seals, and seabirds, and it actually caused a collapse of the local marine population. And the Chugach Alaska Corporation, which is an Alaska Native corporation, filed for bankruptcy protection after this. Okay, so the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, this happened after intense internal negotiations among the various Alaska Native groups. Between the Alaska Federation of Native Delegates, representatives of state and federal government, Congress finally passed this in 1971. Right? It removed Indigenous land title in Alaska. At the time of its passage, ANSA was really different than any previous federal Indian policy. So it divided the state into 12 different regions and mandated the creation of 12 private, for-profit Alaska Native regional corporations and more than 200 private, for-profit Alaska Native village corporations, both owned and enrolled by Alaska Native shareholders who were alive during this time period, right? So this is a really important point to make. So shareholders are people who were alive during that time period. So my mother was a shareholder. However, her shares have to be split up between my sisters and I, and so on and so forth. This is really different than the lower 48 reservation system. The foundation here in Alaska is really based on Alaska Native corporate ownership. So it's a for-profit model with land title under the corporate ownership. This is like really new era in terms of Alaska Native history. Many of the early leaders of the Alaska Native regional corporations had never really worked in a corporate business model, and few of them had college degrees, let alone advanced degrees in business or law. But despite those challenges, the Alaska Native regional corporations have become an integral part of the Alaska economy. So another, I'm kind of showing how the state of Alaska was split up into the different regional corporations. So Bering Straits Regional Corporation is here. I'm in Anchorage right now, which is part of SERI, Cook Inlet Regional Corporation. There was a transfer of 44 million acres and a monetary compensation paid over an 11-year period, an additional 500 million in mineral revenues, and it allowed for federal lease sales to move forward with proceeds going to the government. Right, so the oil and gas exploration on the North Slope and Trans-Alaska Pipeline System created thousands of jobs and pumped revenue into the state, leading to the permanent fund dividend. Right. So as many of us know, fossil fuel combustion is directly related to climate change. And I'm showing kind of two different things right now. I'm showing something that I show a lot in classes is basically this relationship between greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide in green, and then temperature in Antarctica in black. And we're looking at this record that goes back 800,000 years. Right. And so you can see pretty clearly that the greenhouse gas concentration varies very closely with temperature. So they kind of follow each other, right? So the higher the greenhouse gas concentration you have, the warmer the temperature, right? And as we combust fossil fuels, you're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And as we fast forward to the present, we are currently off scale than we've ever been before in the past 800,000 years, right? So we're above 400 parts per million at this point. And because of this increase in carbon dioxide, it's not something that we just use the paleoclimate record for. We can also use like modern measurements. So I'm showing the Keeling curve measured in Mauna Loa, right? So basically these direct measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from about 1957, 1958 to present day. And you see this increasing trend of CO2 in the atmosphere. Right, so we're currently above 420 parts per million, I believe. And so how does this manifest in Alaska or in the Arctic, right? And so as we're changing the climate in the Arctic, we're experiencing hotter temperatures and drier conditions. I'm showing an animation of this really pronounced kind of heat wave that happened in Alaska in 2019. Through early July, and the Arctic is warming about twice as fast as the rest of the world. Some effects of increasing temperature here in Alaska are not only just hot and dry conditions, but increased frequency and intensity of forest fires, right? So the forest fires in Alaska burned over 1.6 million acres in 2019. Another byproduct of climate change is sea ice, the loss of sea ice. Showing an illustration from Zach Lab, basically showing how the extent of Bering sea ice has changed from about 1980 to about 2020, right? And so it varies, throughout the course of this time period. And then in 2020 or 2019, you see this significant drop happening. Another way to kind of visualize it is by looking at some satellite images from NOAA. So we're looking at the Bering Sea in March of 2012. Right here, you can see all the sea ice happening here. And then if you look at what it looked like in February of 2019, you had open water conditions in Alaska during this time period. Again, we care about sea ice because it acts as a platform for fishing and hunting, but it's also an important barrier for storm surges. And I have a short video that I'm just going to play here. Okay, so this was a video that I actually got from my aunt, and it's from a storm surge at Little Diomede in Alaska. And normally you have shorefast sea ice along the coast, which acts as a barrier against storm surges. When you don't have that sea ice, or you have it forming later in the fall or breaking up and going out earlier in the spring, you lose that barrier. And so when you have these storm surges, you end up having catastrophic flooding in a lot of Alaska Native communities. Another byproduct of climate change is thawing permafrost and damage to infrastructure, right? And so Newtok is a place in the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. It's a Yupik village that's received quite a bit of attention because they're in the process of relocating their entire community, right? So they're located on the Ninglik River, and heightened erosion from permafrost degradation. There's been several homes that have already gone into the river. And a third of their residents have already been moved to Matarvik, right? So decades of planning have really led up to this moment. The federal government currently has no comprehensive policy or funding to relocate communities. The cost for Newtok itself is estimated at 100 million. Moving to hub communities, so this has been made as a suggestion for a lot of places. So why doesn't everyone just move to Bethel, or why doesn't everyone just move to Anchorage? It's really not an option for a lot of people who have had generations upon generations living in these particular communities. If you want to learn more about Newtok or the relocation efforts in some other places, I've included a link to a website down here with an option to also donate to their efforts as well. Water security is another important thing to bring up in Alaska. There's a lot of places in Alaska that don't actually have functioning water or sewer systems, right? So the health of Alaska Native communities is threatened by the loss of clean water. So saltwater intrusion, sewage contamination from thawing permafrost, warming conditions also increases exposure to pollutants. So things like mercury, organic pesticides, that have been transported to the Arctic regions and are being released by thawing soils. I wanted to point out that more than 30 Native villages in Alaska are either in the process or in need of relocating. And they're kind of doing this without sort of, this infrastructure in place to assist them. So this kind of brings me to, I wanted to talk briefly about food security. I've talked a bit about subsistence and, how people basically get food from the land, right? And so food security is basically a measure of the availability of food and an individual's ability to access it for a healthy life. And I'm including this graphic from the Food Security Conceptual Framework from the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, or Inuit Circumpolar Council, Alaskan Inuit Food Security Conceptual Framework, right? And so this is basically how they're framing their beliefs about food security in general, right? They've defined food security themselves. In this definition, it's really clear that food security is characterized by a healthy environment, and it's made up of 6 different dimensions. Accessibility, so how can we actually get the food that we need? Availability, is there food? Are there berries there for us to pick? Stability, so how well will we know that fish are swimming up the river during this particular time period? Inuit culture, health and wellness, and decision-making power and management. So those 6 dimensions that kind of surround this food security need tools to support them. And those tools that they've identified are policies, knowledge sources, meaning both Indigenous knowledge and modern science, modern Western science, and true co-management. And they're visualizing this in the form of a drum, and the handle of the drum is food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is extremely important for a lot of Alaska Native communities because you can't have food security without the right of self-governance. There's a strong link between climate change and food security. The IPCC has an entire chapter devoted to it. We know that increasing temperatures, changing precipitation, and frequency of extreme weather events has a huge impact on food security. So it's got multiple threats in Alaska right now, including climate change and pollution. And, food security just isn't about providing food for people to survive, it's also got a strong cultural significance, right? So I'm showing a few pictures of subsistence foods. You know, we have dried fish, and then this is a peek inside someone's freezer. You can see some tundra greens, some fish, maybe some dried fish here. But, you know, for example, in the Bering Straits region, 76% of adults live their way of life hunting and gathering, sharing and providing for families, right? So subsistence still plays a huge part in the cultural identity of a lot of Arctic people. And in general, it can account for up to 80% of rural Alaskans' diets. So in places where a gallon of milk can cost like upwards of $15, you know, relying on the land for subsistence food is extremely important, and also serves as a cultural touchstone, right? Okay. See, I do want to point out that the 10th International Congress on Circumpolar Health in 1996, elders were expressing fear associated with contaminants causing greater harm. So, you know, people do know that persistent organic compounds and other pollutants do exist on their land, right? But to them, you know, the cultural significance outweighs the potential harm, right? Limiting consumption of traditional foods may be more harmful. The social aspects of sharing and subsistence harvests are really integral to the cultural fabric of a lot of different communities. And I do want to point out that subsistence, or the process of subsistence, is using local indigenous knowledge and skills that have been passed down from generations to generations. So it's a way of preserving your cultural identity. And this also provides a really important outlet for physical activity, self-reliance, meaningful, productive work in places where jobs may be limited. Okay, so I know I'm getting close to the hour, and I have one more slide to talk about. And I do want to end on somewhat of a positive note. So perspectives and paths going forward. And I wanted to highlight a publication by Dr. Nikush Carlo, Arctic Observing Indigenous Peoples' History, Perspectives, and Approaches for Partnership. So if you all haven't checked it out already, it's a very valuable tool for people who are interested in conducting research in the Arctic. You know, there's a long and demonstrated past of problematic research engagement with Indigenous peoples in Alaska, ranging from ethical misconduct to an imbalance in research, right? You know, there's been a big push for recent awareness of respect and broader inclusion, self-determination, and authority of Indigenous knowledge and data sovereignty. A lot of equitable relationships start from Indigenous people driving the research questions and the process from idea generation to the ownership and stewardship of data. There's also other resources out there as well. So one thing that I found particularly helpful is a 2018 webinar for Alaska Center for Climate Assessment and Policy at UAF. So Rachel Daniel, Carolina Behe, and Julie Raymond Yakubian kind of went through this entire lecture talking about deliberate and intentional choice, sovereignty, relationships, capacity, trust and respect, ethical principles, empowerment, and decolonization as things that people should kind of use as a framework for working with communities and effectively engaging in knowledge co-production. So yeah, that's all I had today. And I'd like to thanks everyone for sticking through to the end, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for a fantastic presentation. I've dropped a couple of links in the chat to the different resources that you discussed, especially on the last slide. So if folks are looking for those, you can find them there. We have time for just a couple of questions if anyone wants to put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you'd rather speak directly. And if you're on the phone, to raise your hand is *9. I'll give folks just a minute since I know typing takes some time. Give people just another minute for questions. I think, oh, We have a hand raised from Catherine Lavelle. Go ahead.
I've definitely come as you are. But anyway, thank you for a great presentation. I learned so much, and I'm just wondering if you've published anything yourself on this, or if you have any syllabus or something for those of us who want to learn more.
Yeah, no, so I haven't published anything myself. Thanks for the nice words, but I do have a syllabus that I made for this class, and it basically starts with this first lecture talking about the history a bit, which is kind of hard. I think the lecture in the class ended up taking the full 2 hours, but in the class, we kind of go through different topics. So things like ecosystem perturbation. There's a whole lecture about food security. There's a lecture about like what is indigenous knowledge. There's lectures about air quality related to forest fires and human health. We had a lot of guest lectures come in. And then for each week, I had assigned readings for students. So yeah, I'd be happy to share it with you if you just send me an email, and I can send that along.
Sarah, would it be possible for me to post a PDF of it on the event page too? Are you willing to have it that wide? Sure.
Yeah, that's
great.
fine.
So when I post the recording of this, I will also make sure the syllabus is there. So you'll be able to find that on the event page that you used to find this event, and then I'll put it in the notes for the YouTube page.
Okay, yeah.
And then we've got a question from Mary in the chat. You mentioned research in Alaska. There's so much to be done. So can you speak a little bit about the research that you're doing?
Yeah, so I work on fine dust, so fine grained particles of rock, basically, that get lifted into the atmosphere and transported to different terrestrial or marine ecosystems. And right now, we're not doing community engaged research. So we basically are working across Ketchimek Bay and setting up some passive dust collectors. And I do want to do some research in Unalakleet related to permafrost degradation and sediment, transport in the water, and what that means for, I guess like sediment load and metals and stuff like that. And that would involve more community participation and engagement. I just haven't embarked on that process yet. So I am thinking about things that I'd like to do here, but I should say I started my position at Scripps in 2019. So I'm kind of just like getting my feet wet in terms of getting my research started and stuff like that. But it's definitely, I'm excited to be able to kind of figure out ways to come back to Alaska to do more research here. Yeah. So yeah, I think that like the reason that I decided to teach this seminar was that there were a lot of students and colleagues at UCSD who are working in the Arctic or who would like to work in the Arctic, and they had a lot of questions for me about a bit about the history and the structure and the way that Alaska was kind of set up a bit. And yeah, I mean, I think I decided that, well, it seems like there's enough interest here that it'd be worthwhile to just have a class about it. And like a lot of the experiences, it's been an interesting, process, because a lot of the experiences, it's a mixture between like what I've learned, academically, like through undergraduate and graduate school, but then also some of the experiences that like, my family have gone through. So it's just been kind of a non-traditional class and kind of a bit of an experiment, but I've enjoyed the process so far. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. We're at the top of the hour, so I see some folks dropping off, and I'm gonna wrap us up here. Thank you so much for a fantastic presentation, and thank you all of you for joining us. And again, I'll post the recording on the event page and on our YouTube. And I will also include the syllabus that Sarah has used. So thanks again. Hope to see you at future IRPIC events.
Thank you. Bye.